But firstly, I'd like to point out that the MLA, the Manx Landlords Association, are not opposed to raising standards and improving tenants' conditions for individuals living in substandard properties. I'd also like to make the point that less than 5% of landlords on the Isle of Man fit into that category. So the vast majority are good landlords.
So how do you measure that, just out of interest, Alan?
Well, I suppose you measure it anecdotally initially, but we have a large membership. We know the type of people that are our members. We know the sort of problems that they encounter, and we probably know some of the less reputable landlords. And I have to say, our membership is primarily of better quality landlords.
Well, what are the unintended... You mentioned you're not averse to change, but you are averse to this bill. What are the consequences that you're so concerned about?
Well, let me say that private sector housing fulfills a huge gap in the local rental market. There's simply not enough public sector housing stock. So it's important we don't damage the sector as a whole. And as I say, we're not opposed to the raising of standards where it's necessary. And I do emphasise the fact that that's a very small minority. But in terms of unintended consequences, there's huge additional bureaucratic and legislative burdens being imposed on landlords. And that's going to drive quite a number of landlords out of the market.
Is it because of the cost of doing them?
I think it's the cost. I think it's the threat of jail terms, huge fines.
But surely they're on the most severe end of the scale there.
I'm sure they are, yeah. I'm absolutely sure they are. But the fact is, the legislation's going to be put in place. And if I can give you a couple of very real examples that have been brought to me recently. Comments from one landlord. We have 22 beautiful apartments. With 80 pages of new legislations, compliance, penalties, it's not possible for me to carry on running these, as we do now. Another landlord said, my greatest concern is for my tenants. I think of around 40 of them as family members, and these include DSS tenants. These are not comments from rogue landlords, but these are people who will leave the industry.
So what is, we've talked about this issue in the public domain a lot, but perhaps not in the detail. Give us what are the things that the landlord would be required to do that would make it so onerous and difficult to continue, the good landlords, I mean, to continue their operation? Okay,
I'm really glad you've asked me that. That's a great question. Let's take an example. Let's look at the towns. We'll take Douglas. We're in Douglas at the moment. There are a large number of properties here in Douglas that are converted into apartments or multi-let tenancies. Now, one of the unintended consequences is that within this bill, government are looking to further their green agenda, which is great, and in principle, nobody has a problem with dealing with climate change. But what they're looking to enforce are things like modern, up-to-date installation standards. Now, to bring a Victorian property up to modern-day standards for insulation is simply not economical. So what this legislation will do when it comes into force, if it comes into force, it will force all those local properties out of the rental market because they simply will not be able to comply in any economical format. So it will force them out of the market. So another unintended consequence is that these people will no longer have properties to rent in town, thereby forcing them out of town slightly. What does that do? That pushes up rents. It puts more pressure on the available housing stock. In addition to that, it increases transport. What does that do for our green agenda? The more people we take out of town, the more transport we need to get them into town.
But surely there's a middle ground here. I mean, in terms
Absolutely.
of, yeah, I mean, there are, I must stress, there are minimum standards that do govern environmental health rules that govern property standards. You've got rules on houses of multiple occupancy. But give us some other examples, because some people would say having rules that govern the relationship between landlords and tenants is important, because you might have one side abusing the rules. And I know that works both ways, but surely you'd agree that something that defines the relationship, so, I don't know, a landlord won't hold on to a deposit longer than he should, or a tenant won't pay up for longer than he should. Surely having a set of rules in place there to make sure no one's abusing the relationship, surely that's a step in the right direction.
It could be considered a step in the right direction, but would an independent ombudsman scheme not do an equally good job without all the additional bureaucracy and without driving huge numbers of landlords out of the market?
So, well, that driving them out, I mean, what's to say others won't step in?
Well, how do you step in if, let's take that gentleman with 60 apartments in town. It's not economically viable for him to bring those up to modern insulation standards. Who's going to step in and do that? It just isn't going to happen. These properties are going to go into the private sector as apartments for sale. Now, I don't believe government can fulfil that gap. Honestly, I really do not believe that they can fulfil that gap. So I have no problem with standards, but what's wrong with this market? Is it so underperforming? Is it so bad that we need this draconian legislation? Or do we have a very small number of rogue landlords that probably do need to be dealt with in one form or another, and we have existing legislation that will do that?
Well, let's talk about the association then, if we can. What is it championing? Because we've heard several members come out. They've been in the media. But is it a cohesive association? Is it a cohesive unit? I know there's a lot of landlords to represent, and some will definitely have different views to others. But can the organisation, does it have a single voice? Does it have a single view on this?
It absolutely does. And I have to be honest that historically it probably hasn't spoken with one voice, but it hasn't really needed to, because the market has just moved along nicely. There haven't been any major issues. These days, it's a completely different animal. It's now focused. It's formulated.
It's bigger.
It's much bigger. It's much bigger. But also, it has a committee. It has a structure, and it speaks with one voice. Hence the reason I'm here talking to you today.
Well, how did you feel about not being directly consulted by the DOI? They said you weren't a recognised industry body.
They did say that, and that was one of the reasons that I got involved, and one of the reasons that it's now formally structured. And in fairness to the DOI, we have met with them, and we've had one meeting. It was a fairly cordial meeting, but I think the overriding opinion that we left that meeting with was that they're not really interested in dialogue. They're pushing this legislation through come what may. And I think that's quite a short-sighted, misguided approach.
Well, they've had a consultation. Those results are out there if anyone wants to have a look at them. A lot of landlords responded, obviously, like you'd hope. They could make sizable changes before this bill goes to Tynwald for consideration. So does that not give you some hope?
Absolutely, it gives us hope, and that's one of the reasons I'm up here talking to you today. I will also be calling for meetings with interested parties, including Minister Baker and hopefully the Chief Minister, if he's got the time to talk to us. There is an opportunity here to draft something that is less draconian and that will be fit for purpose. And that's my primary aim.
Do we have to start again with this bill, or do you believe, as the association, that what is presented can be changed in such a way that it's more palatable for your association?
I think everything's about compromise, and I think what we've got here is a draconian bill that has not been thought out well. Nobody's really considered all the unintended consequences.
So
Another,
scrap it and start again would be the advice, or
it's not my place to give advice. I would certainly look at it again, and I would consult properly, because another thing you have to remember is that this consultation that went out during COVID lockdown. On the government's own website, they stated that they'd consulted with the Landlords Association. When it was pointed out that they hadn't, that statement was removed from the government website. So I think the whole thing needs rethinking. We have to remember we have a first-term MHK here who's been thrust into a ministerial position, and obviously he's going to make mistakes. But I think we've all got to be big enough to see the mistakes we've made, enter into dialogue, and come up with something that's fit for purpose.
do you think